All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Casey Holder. I coordinate classes and events here at Precision Camera. Whether or not you've been tuning in for the whole expo or just for this session, welcome. We're glad to have you. Always exciting to have our friends from the Houston Center for Photography in for some kind of class or event. We've been working with them recently to just kind of bring awareness of their program to the folks here in Austin. So I'm sure Lou will speak to that a little bit more and a little bit more eloquently. But yeah, Lou's a very fantastic photographer, and he'll be talking today about adding photographic voice or style to your work. So with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you, Lou. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and you guys have a good session.
All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. You can hear my voice, can't see my face, but this is Lou Benjamin speaking from the center of Houston. And actually, one of the things I'd like to do is get you guys to type into the chat pod where you're tuning in from, just so I can kind of get a feel for who I'm speaking to and what parts of the world. It's always exciting to do these presentations with Precision Camera because they have such a wide audience. You already heard this is a joint presentation between Precision Camera and Houston Center for Photography. And this Houston Center for Photography is a nonprofit gallery. It's an educational space and a publisher based in Houston. And its mission is to increase society's understanding and appreciation of photography and its evolving role in contemporary culture. Photography has really taken the center of really the central position within the arts. It's used to document, it's used to express, it's used to communicate. It's a very powerful medium. I'm acknowledging that today is Juneteenth, and a lot of people are actually not working because it is Juneteenth. But I don't really consider this work, what I'm doing right now. This is sharing my passion. And it's not really the same thing as going to work. I think as an artist, I'm always involved in creating or sharing. Couple of things I'm going to do. Let's see. Let me just look. Chris is from Austin. Jonathan is also in Austin. That's very cool. Very cool. I'm also going to share a couple of links and acknowledge that part of our collaboration with Precision Camera, if you purchase a camera from Precision, they will give you a coupon for a free one-year membership to Houston Center for Photography. So thanks to Precision Camera for your support and sponsorship in that fashion. So it has to be a relatively brief introduction to this idea of photographic voice. We actually do a couple of different workshops based on this idea. And I will be including some links to the class, the follow-on class that you can participate in if you'd like to. And I will put that in the chat pod. I'll bring it up again. I'll mention it again at the end of this session. The follow-up session to this is August 11th, 18th, 25th, and September 1st from 6 to 8 p.m. So on Tuesdays. So I'll go ahead and put that in there. Nanette, coming from Houston. Awesome. Okay, so there is the intensive, and I'll also, at the end of this, I'll also put up some links for just the general courses available from Houston Center for Photography. So here we are. As I said, this is an introduction, so it's going to be brief, but hopefully valuable to you. So what in the world are we talking about, this photographic voice or artistic voice? What is it? When somebody says, I can tell you that this is a photograph by Ansel Adams, just by looking at it, they're acknowledging the strength of a particular photographic voice. The idea of voice is something that goes beyond style. It arises out of the photographer's unique interests, sensibilities, passions, and ways of seeing. You know, people talk about a photographer that has a particularly keen eye, so to speak. That's speaking to the voice. If I take a different metaphor, music really influences me quite a bit. And so, you know, people know it's a Rolling Stones tune, regardless of whether it's blues, a hard rocking tune, or a ballad. Same thing with, say, Earth, Wind, and Fire. You know, I've heard people call Earth, Wind, and Fire a funk band, but they're not really funk, right? They're their own thing. And so that idea of voice is throughout the arts, throughout the different creative endeavors. And your voice is already present in your work, but chances are it's not very strong. If you're at the beginning of your process, and this is something that's going to be going on really through the arc of your, call it career, call it whatever you want to call it, as an artist, as long as you continue to keep making work, your voice will strengthen, evolve, even perhaps change focus. But there is that quality that's there, and it's something that goes beyond style. So it's about attitude, tone of voice. You're going to recognize a strong photographic voice, a strong creative voice whenever you encounter it. Lisa Condon said, the process of finding your voice is like uncovering your own superpower. Your artistic voice is what sets you apart and ultimately what makes your work interesting, distinctive, worthy of discourse, and desired by others. No matter your medium or genre, having your own voice is the holy grail. So we get a sense of an artist's voice when we look at bodies of work. You know, you might have some sense of the voice in looking at a single picture if it's particularly well crafted or something, but the idea of voice, as I said, it's sort of a backbone that runs through all the work that you make, even if you're making work in different styles over time. So you begin to see commonalities such as choice of subject matter, visual design, use of color and contrast. Any of those sorts of factors help determine or give body to, give form to your voice. So the major qualities of your creative voice are the style, and I put an asterisk by that because, as I already said, style is not voice. Style is someone will have a particular creative voice and yet operate in multiple styles, multiple media. And so it's not, the style does not define the voice. That's the point. Bill Brandt is one photographer who's been really celebrated. And he said, toward the end of the war, I think that means World War II, my style had changed completely. I'd often been asked why this happened. I think I gradually lost my enthusiasm for reportage. Documentary photography had become fashionable. Everybody was doing it. And so he changed. You know, Prince talked about he used drum machines before almost everybody else. And there was a point where he said everybody was using drum machines, so I threw mine out. And he went back to using live drums. So we can talk in terms of this idea of looking at bodies of work, looking at multiple photos to get a sense of photographic voice, get a sense of what that is. And so we're going to look at a few examples here. And I'm going to kind of fly through these, but I hope you'll get a sense. This is Thomas Allen. So you can see he's constructing his images, and he's actually physically making things and then photographing them. This is Diane Arbus, celebrated photographer, portraiture, and one of her things is that she considered herself an outsider, kind of a freak, so to speak, and so she really emphasized that. She looked for that in the people that she photographed. She considered herself one of them. She wasn't gawking at them. Richard Avedon, one of the most, I would say, articulate people about his concept of what photography is, how it works, what portraiture is, how to do it effectively. So we had In the American West as one body of work. This is some of his fashion portraiture. And this is a portrait of a singer. Edward Bertinsky. He's interested in environment and environmentalism, and he renders these incredible, beautiful images. Marie Casindus, one of the first woman to have her work included in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art, and an early pioneer of color photography. She studied with Ansel Adams, and Ansel looked at her work. She was shooting black and white at the time, and Ansel looked at her work and said, you know, it's obvious that you see in color. You should be doing color photography. You shouldn't be doing black and white. So this idea of voice, again, goes back to the way that you see, your ways of seeing, your ways of interacting. Tim Davis. Roy DeCarva. William Eggleston. He had a famous quote in his book, The Democratic Forest, where he talked about how everyone expected photographs to have a certain kind of formalism, have the subject of the photograph be crystal clear, right smack in the middle of the photo, to create what he called obvious photos. And he declared that he was at war with the obvious. So a lot of his work is really about representation, about framing, about angle. Lee Friedlander. And so my point being that obviously each of these photographers have one or more distinct styles that they're representing their work in, and yet there is something beneath the surface that runs through consistently through their work. And the more work that they produce, and the more well-edited bodies of work that they produce, the more clear their vision becomes to you. So voice is about your way of seeing, your way of thinking. Robert Mapplethorpe, his images are always brilliantly produced. Technical, he's sort of the pinnacle of technical execution. Lindsay McCrum. I discovered Lindsay probably 15 years ago. She did a book called, I think it's Chicks with Guns. And it was a set of formal portraits of women who were deep in gun culture. So there was this wonderful portrait and the backstory, the women's own voices speaking about their involvement with guns, their love of guns, and so forth. So this is one of the shots from that book. And this is another. Jeff Mermelstein, street photographer extraordinaire. I would call him an anthropologist photographer. And there's for me, a direct connect between this shot by Mermelstein and this shot by Daido Moriyama, celebrated Japanese photographer, but obviously done in a very different style. This is also Daido Moriyama. Completely different subject matter, but again, that high contrast, moody, really dramatic approach to image making is obvious. And then this as well. James Nachtwey, celebrated war photographer, documentary photographer, does some amazing work. And it's not all things being blown up. Gordon Parks, one of my heroes. The story is that he saw a magazine with some of the Farm Security Agency photographs in it, sitting on a train, flipped through it and thought, hey, I should try doing this. He ultimately ended up working for the Farm Security Agency for a while, doing photography and documenting life in the South. It's no accident, by the way, that this particular image is connect with the famous American Gothic painting by Grant Wood. He intentionally did that, including having the mop in the background as sort of a stand-in for the second person. And not only did he do documentary photography, but he shot fashion. He did movies. He wrote books. He was a true Renaissance man. So, you know, we don't have to be stuck in a single mode. Martin Parr. He said something about how he likes to observe society with a sort of a twist, an ironic twist. And you really get that sense of irony and rich color in his work. Irving Penn. Irving Penn has graphic design in his background, and you can tell how carefully framed, carefully composed all of his imagery is. And he's not only interested in where things sit within the frame and how the elements work together, but he's also highly what's the word? He's very careful about his use of compositional tools, color, form, texture, etc. That's Miles Davis's hand. You know, who would have thought that you could actually do a portrait of someone and just convey so much about that person just by photographing their hand? You know, we think of a portrait so often as a face. Cindy Sherman. She is one of the original photographers exploring representation. She did a series called Untitled Film Stills, where basically she's playing characters. These aren't self-portraits in the sense of she's not trying to tell a story about herself. She's trying to tell a bigger story about representation and how people view the world and view people and view women specifically. Stephen Shore. One of my early influences, and I've actually heard another photographer say that that Jerry Uelsmann was one of his early influences. Is Jerry Uelsmann. He essentially resurrected a technique that was around in the very early days of photography. They used to do what was called combination printing, where they would literally cut up pieces of negatives and then reassemble them, and then make prints from those reassembled negatives, those compound negatives. And Jerry developed a very sophisticated, updated version of that using, I think it's 7 enlargers in the darkroom. And I'm convinced that the people at Adobe or Barney Scan or whatever the company was called at the beginning of Photoshop saw his work and knew that they really had, that set the bar for what compositing, what digital compositing had to be capable of doing. And Jerry, to this day, still works in the darkroom. He does not do digital. But this kind of, I mean, I first saw his work in the mid-70s, and this is now, you know, people look at this work and they immediately think, oh, it must have been done with Photoshop, and in fact it isn't. The thing that I also want to acknowledge, the point that I was also making about this thing of he basically updated a Victorian technique, is that one of the things as you start to develop your own work, your own bodies of work, your own voice, to have your voice fill out, is to understand the context, to understand where you're sitting in the history of your form. You know, you can kind of just shoot, but if you actually if you think it through and put some intention behind the choices that you're making, you'll have a stronger, richer voice. Gary Winogrand, one of the people who really set street photography, took street photography to another level. I'm convinced that shot was an inspiration for a shot in the movie Chinatown, and I know for certain that the photograph of the twins. I'm going to jump back to that. The Dion Arbus photograph of the twins inspired the cinematographer for The Shining. So photography speaks to the other arts, and the other arts speak to photography. It's really kind of interesting how the different media, the different forms, really communicate with each other, or in conversation with each other. Photographers, when they're making work, are constantly in a conversation, either in a conversation with their audience directly, or even in conversation with other photographers. There's whole bodies of work, there's whole fields of photography where people are riffing on other work. They're not simply mimicking it, they're taking it and giving it a different spin. So Minor White said all photographs are self-portraits. What I'd like you to do, hopefully you have a piece of paper handy, or a notepad application or something like that. I want you to take a minute and make note of these things. Write this down for yourself. What's your favorite style of music? Name 2 favorite artists, any medium. So they could be writers, they could be painters, they could be photographers, dancers. 2 of your favorite artists. What are your biggest interests other than photography? Is there something you want to express or document with photography? And bonus question, does a work of art have to be beautiful? So just write those things down, and I'll wait for a minute or two. You can go ahead and, I guess, type in the chat pod once you're done, once you've got that stuff written down. Okay. So the reason I had you write that down is I really want you to just start to think about what's motivating you when you're shooting. Artistic voice, photographic voice is all about motivation. It's all about whether it's conscious or unconscious. Okay, whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's something where you can strengthen your voice by tuning into what's motivating you and then focus in on that. Oscar Wilde said, "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken." Henry Horenstein said, "Shoot what you love." He actually wrote a book called "Shoot What You Love." It's an excellent book, by the way. Dion Arbus said, "Take pictures of what you fear." And Quinn Jacobson said, "If you have a context and intention for your work, you've started the journey to defining your personal photographic voice." So you can strengthen your voice. You want to develop what I would call your inner game. And you want to be intentional. So you want to start to focus and direct your energy and your efforts into making things, but you don't want it to be completely mechanical. You still want to be open. You still want to respond. I heard somebody describe art making in general as an artist experiences things and then they process the experience through whatever medium that they're working with. And so this idea of whether you're a person who constructs photographs, constructs imagery, so you build elaborate sets and then light everything carefully and you bring people in and you actually direct them like a movie director. That's on one end of the extreme. But even when you do that, very often things will come up during the production process, during the actual making of the photograph where you say, oh, wait a second, let's change that. Do this instead. So that's that openness, that willingness to adapt. At the other extreme are people, I like to use the metaphor, you talk about, are you a farmer or are you a hunter? You know, a street photographer puts themselves in a particular place and they just go out and try to bag photos. They're constantly looking around, looking and responding. And they're intentional in the sense of, I'm going to go to this location. But then they're open to whatever occurs. They've got their eyes open, they're responding. Next thing, be prolific and trust the process. So in other words, make lots of stuff. Keep shooting, keep shooting, keep shooting. I also heard a photographer say that one of the things you want to do is if you have the instinct, if you feel motivated to trip the shutter, just go ahead and make that photo. Just press the shutter. Don't try to make sense out of it in the moment. You want to stifle that critical voice. You don't want to second guess. You want to frame it and shoot it and move on. And then once you've got that image in the can, you want to stifle the temptation to go, oh, that didn't work, and delete it. The only thing I ever delete from my archive are black frames. I had no light, no exposure. There's no data there. There's nothing to recover. So that was that. But everything else, even the shots where I draped the camera over my shoulder and the shutter accidentally fired, and so it's a blurry shot of the sidewalk. Even those I keep. I don't know that they'll ever become art. I don't know that they'll ever fit in with some body of work, but you never know. It might be 7, it might be 10, it might be 15 years later. All of a sudden you realize, hey, wait a second, this thing works with these 3 other photos. And now all of a sudden you have a body of work. All of a sudden that frame, that still image becomes art. So be prolific, trust the process. And then finally, beware the validation trap. There's too many people who are constantly looking at, did this get likes on Instagram? Did I get the whatever prize on whatever image sharing platform is out there? It's really not about that. When we're talking about your photographic voice, we're talking about refining your way of speaking, in quotes, of communicating visually with a photograph. And people may or may not get it right from the start. Maybe I'd go as far as to say they probably won't get it from the start. So the whole thing is that what you want to do is you want to figure out, does it speak to me? Does the image speak to me? And if the image speaks to me, then it's worthy. Richard Avedon said, I worked out a series of no's. No to exquisite light, no to apparent compositions, no to the seduction of poses or narrative. All these no's force me to the yes. I have a white background, I have the person I'm interested in, and the thing that happens between us. So that's a very powerful way of framing how he makes photographs. And I keep using the word makes because I'm a firm believer. I always use the word image, and I always use, well, not always, but I generally use the phrase making a photograph rather than taking. Ansel Adams said photographs are made, not taken. And I love the word image or photograph. I love the word image because image comes from the same root as imagination. It's all about our imagining. It's all about our way of seeing, our way of thinking about what's going on. The way that we think predetermines what we see. So our thinking and our seeing are closely tied together. If you're an optimist, you're going to view a certain situation very different than if you're a pessimist. It's the same series of facts, but you've got distinctly different opinions about it. And that comes true, the same is true for when you're photographing something. You put the same scene in front of 3 different photographers, and I guarantee you will get 3 very different renderings of that scene. At least 3. You might get more. So, going back to this idea of photographic voice, this guy, Simon Sinek, he's actually a business consultant. And so he was actually speaking about businesses and business models in this golden circle paradigm that he developed. But I think it's totally relevant to a photographer or any kind of artist. People don't buy, okay? People don't subscribe to what you do. They buy why you do it. So if you want to develop your voice, you have to understand your why. So what do I mean by that? Well, Tim Davis said, photography became more than a tool for understanding the world. It was a method of generating meaning. It was a way to survive. Gordon Parks said, I picked up a camera because it was my choice of weapons against what I hated most about the world, including racism, intolerance, and poverty. So those are some pretty lofty, pretty powerful contexts for why you're making what might be just pretty pictures, right? But with as much ugliness as is going on in the world, there's a place, there's an appropriate place for creating beauty. So how do you actually go about making statements, expressing yourself photographically? Well, one of the most powerful tools for expressing yourself photographically is composition. That includes your choice of framing, your point of view, lines, use of lines, selective focus, so shallow depth of field, infinite depth of field. What are you putting the figure against? There's a term called figure versus ground. So making conscious choices about those sorts of things before you trip the shutter. Composing. So understanding the theories of visual design can help you go from an arrangement of elements that's simply nice to something that communicates effectively with your viewer. Did the person that you were photographing, did they just land smack in the middle of the frame and there's all this stuff distracting so that you really can't tell what's going on? Or did you select an angle where that person is put into dynamic tension with the background or with things that are going on in the scene, so that something more effective, something stronger arises from it? I like to talk in terms of whether or not work is effective as opposed to whether it's a good photo or not. Try not to put heavy value judgments on it. It's really more about, if you have the intent to explore a particular idea, how do you actually go about composing a piece that explores that idea? Sometimes you can't do it with just a single photo. Sometimes you need several photos to be able to tell a story. A single photo freezes everything in time. So there's a limit to how much that can be conveyed in a single frame. To expand your visual vocabulary, you want to curate your influences and steal from them. Okay? Picasso said, lesser artists borrow, great artists steal. And so by that, I think he meant that you make it your own. I saw one time a painting of his that was sort of half man, half bull or something. And it wasn't really cubist, not yet, but it was really interesting because there was an African mask shown in a diptych with it. And you could clearly see where the geometry, the spatial qualities of that mask influenced what he had painted. But he had certainly not copied it. He had not borrowed the design of that mask. He had taken it, internalized it, and translated it into something else. So that's the difference that I mean by borrowing versus stealing. Robert Mapplethorpe said, the more pictures you see, the better you are as a photographer. He talked about how you don't even necessarily know how you're being influenced. You just know that you are being, well, maybe you don't know that you're being influenced. But you go ahead and you make a bunch of photos, and all of a sudden you look and you sit and you see the connection back to something that maybe you saw 10 or 15 years ago. We're constantly consuming. You know, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're all over the place. We're constantly consuming imagery. I would say passively. What you can do is you can actually actively curate. You can actually intentionally select some of the work that you look at. And the thing, by the way, as you're doing that, you don't want to just look at it and say, I like it, I don't like it. You want to collect the things that really speak to you. And you want to inquire, as you're doing that, you want to inquire, well, what is it specifically about this that I like? Is it use of color? Is it composition? Is it contrarianism? Is it a particular worldview. All of those sorts of things, to the degree that you can kind of check in with yourself and figure out what resonates with you, you'll be that much more effective at articulating your work, producing work that has a strong resonance, has the sound of your voice in it. Another thing to consider, use of light, qualities of light. So hard light is going to produce a very different image than soft light. Window light is a particular type of soft light. Open shade is a technique that Avedon used real effectively in the Portraits from the American West. He stood people on the shadow side of a building, and the light, the flat, very soft light that fell on the subjects was the result of light bouncing off of everything else and then coming into the shadows. It's a very different technique than going into a studio with a strobe and raking it sideways across someone's face. And then you can look at, again, strategies. Flat lighting is direct toward the subject. Butterfly lighting is a particular style of lighting that's used a lot in glamour type photography. Rembrandt lighting is very dramatic, and it's basically one side of the face is lit, the other isn't, except for a little triangle of light that falls under the eye. When you've got shadows, sometimes those shadows are too intense and you want to fill those shadows. Backlighting produces silhouettes. It also produces halos and kind of almost like a fog-like effect. But it can also be very dreamy and can work very effectively. If any of you are food photographers, it turns out that one of the sort of open secrets about good food photography is the strongest light is coming from behind. There may be fill light in the foreground, but most food looks better backlit. Who knew? There's also something called a kicker, which can be used to outline, to separate someone from the background. So there's basically a very bright line, let's say, that goes across the shoulders, and or the hair for that matter. There's something called hair light, which is kind of a variation of that, where the person is in dark clothes against a dark background, but by throwing this kicker onto them, it creates an outline that separates them from the background. Consider also the elements of visual design: composition, line, shape, layering, color, texture, rhythm and movement, pattern. All these things are useful metaphors, tools within visual language, and understanding how important any of those things are to you in the work that you're making, and really having an opinion about those things helps you make your work stronger. So here's line, one example of line. Here's another example of line. There's an implied line created by the headstones. There's a barrier created by the pickets in the foreground. Shape. We are tuned to see shapes, to see primitive shapes. We automatically see rectangles, squares, circles, diamonds, diagonals. Form is sometimes described separately, but form is shape plus light. It's three-dimensional. Form is three-dimensional, whereas we think of shape itself as a flat shape. So depending upon how you light, form is going to be more or less revealed. Layering. We've got foreground, middle ground, background. use of color, complementary color strategies, analogous colors, so colors that are all on the same side of the color wheel with each other. Really understanding color relationships is very powerful. Black and white are colors. Also, an image that's monochromatic, meaning one color, can be warm toned or cool toned, and so it's actually a color image, but and our brains process colors we process color with a different part of our brain than we process tonality, light versus dark. So they speak different languages. A black and white image or a monochrome image speaks a different language, a different visual language than the color image. Texture. Again, texture is revealed through lighting. Backlighting, side lighting is going to emphasize texture in a way that frontal lighting will not. Rhythm and movement. You have 2 fast beats, a long rest, a beat, a rest, a beat, another long rest, 2 quick beats, rest, beat, 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 beat. So there's rhythm, and there's also movement. So there's a rhythm to the footfalls, but you can also tell the direction that they're going. And so we read all those things in a photograph all the time. You can consciously, intentionally compose with those ideas in mind. And finally, pattern and repeating imagery. So the repetition, the squiggly lines, the repetition of the lines, all of those things, those are patterns, and they have a certain power that comes across in an image. So again, the whole conversation is about improving your photographic voice, developing your photographic voice, strengthening your photographic voice. And how you do that is you train your eye. You devote time to experimenting with different styles and techniques. You don't want to just stay in wherever you are. You don't want to lock yourself into a singular style, so to speak. There's a lot of people who talk about develop a style and sort of go in that direction, and it's not usually a bad thing, but it's probably more constraining than it needs to be. And that after having said that, there is a reason to create constraints for yourself. So maybe you do a body of work in a particular style, but that doesn't mean you have to stay in that style for every body of work that you produce. So you want to experiment. And the thing with experiments is that experiments fail. Supposedly, Edison said that every failed experiment when he was producing the light bulb only taught him how you can't make a light bulb. He didn't consider them as some sort of moral failure. He didn't let that stop him. He kept trying different things. And so you want to give yourself the time and space to play with things, try things that are strange, and don't be frustrated by the fact that you didn't get a result that you like. Don't be afraid to fail. And you have to make a lot of bad work before you can get somewhere good. And so that's the whole thing. You're just making stuff. You're just trying stuff out. You're experimenting. You're exploring. You're riffing on something that you saw someone do, some work that you admire. But you're trying to make it your own. You're not simply trying to reproduce what it is that they did. And so here we are. What's next with all of this? Well, it's really about just getting out there and getting to work, learning how your seeing works, how your how your eye works, what you're interested in, and dig into that. And just keep making photos as much as you can. Just keep making them. You can go back and review your catalog. You know, some of you may have hundreds, if not thousands, of photos in your archive that you haven't looked at in years. Go back and look at those, and you'll begin to see things about how you see. Review those. You can create bodies of work out of the stuff that you already have, never mind what you want to shoot next. And so there's a lot that's out there. So you want to get to work, you want to keep working, you want to build small collections, bodies of work that help you to define your view of the world. And the artistic world is your oyster, so to speak. What's next from here is we are offering an intensive workshop. I'll be teaching it starting August 11th from 6 to 8 p.m. So Tuesday's August 11th from 6 to 8 p.m. And we'll be doing it over Zoom online. And then there are also other courses available from Houston Center for Photography that you might be interested in. I'm going to go and try to find, if I can, where is it? Here we go. I'm going to paste into the chat pod. I don't know how the Facebook Live people will be able to see this, but I'm going to paste into the chat pod one more time links to that. So I'm going to post a link here to the class. And also, I'm going to post a link to the other general classes that are available at Houston Center for Photography. There are a lot. We do quite a bit of online work in everything from Photoshop and Lightroom basics to theory to history of photography, you name it. So yeah, that's basically all I have to offer. I really appreciate your spending some time with us, and I hope you got some value out of this presentation. Bye.